Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Wednesday, November 24th, 2021, and today I'm going to be taking a look at the two extremes of gerrymandering in our brand new congressional maps from Ohio and Illinois as we enter into the 2022 midterm election cycle, in which these two maps have completely pushed away the opposition party's voice from being accurately and fairly represented in Washington, D.C. for likely the next 10 years. Illinois is completely controlled by Democrats when it comes down to the redistricting process. Altogether, they have about 17 districts to allocate to either political party, and ultimately the map ended up with 14 Democratic districts and 3 Republican districts. For the Ohio Republican Party, in which they have complete control over the redistricting process in the state of Ohio, you can see here that the Democrats now have 2 seats and the Republicans effectively have 13. So altogether, these two maps are very big, extreme differences when it comes down to representation for either political party. And this comes largely as an effort by both sides to really have the upper hand when it comes into the 2022 House elections. Taking a look at the national overview, Democrats currently have a narrow advantage nationwide, adding 6 new Democratic-leaning seats with 2 new Republican-leaning seats with -5 highly competitive seats. This also indicates that our nation is on track to become less and less competitive in the future election cycles. As unfortunate as that is for the average swing and independent voter, it is very good for incumbents and partisan identity politics type of thinking for both sides. When it comes down to issues that impact voters the most, we will not see a fair and accurate representation of independent and centrist voter sentiment on the nationwide level. Instead, these will be the extreme versions of both political parties, which would then contribute to the polarization of our nation in itself. But ultimately, that's what the purpose of these maps are, and that's almost always been the purpose of them since the beginning of time in America's history. Now, looking at these two maps, the reason why I bring them up is because I have made 2 videos detailing the extreme GOP gerrymander in the state of Ohio and the extreme Democratic gerrymander in the state of Illinois. These two states are polar opposites, yet lie on the similar region right across the Rust Belt there. Some would argue Illinois is technically not a part of the main Rust Belt, and it usually isn't when we talk about the Rust Belt states. I usually refer to Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Ohio. Those are the Rust Belt states when we talk about the grouping in the presidential election, but Illinois is in a very similar region. You have a lot of white working class voters here, and you have a lot of inner cities that can be cracked in different ways or pushed out into a singular district for the purpose of consolidating Democratic or Republican voters. But looking at Illinois, let's take this one for instance, because it actually is a less extreme gerrymander from what we've seen compared to Ohio, and I'll show you what I mean by that. This is not me trying to make the Democratic Party look any better or any worse than they actually are, and the same goes for when I bring up the state of Ohio. This is me merely showing you what the maps have been drawn in such a way and how they are unfairly representing voices, but there is one map, Ohio's, that does seem to unfairly represent voices a bit more, considering that Illinois is practically a safe Democratic state. In the 2020 election, Joe Biden won 57.5% of the vote to Donald Trump's 40.6%. That is a margin of nearly 17 points, right? 16.9% difference between the two. You would expect the Republican Party to probably have somewhere around 41% representation based off the 2020 election, or somewhere similar to that. But what the Illinois Democratic Party did instead was decided to make this map extremely gerrymandered to a point where Republicans would only have 3 out of 17 districts. Even this toss-up district, this one that is deemed competitive, has a partisan lean of Democrat plus 4. That means relative to the rest of the nation, it is 4 points more Democratic. Considering that Joe Biden won the popular vote in the 2020 election by a margin of 4.5%, in any normal non-wave or non-type of landslide year for either political party, Democrats actually would probably do very well in that district itself. So ultimately, this new map gives the Republican Party 3 solid seats. Previously, they had 4 solid seats and a Republican-leaning seat, and an additional Republican-leaning seat in the 17th district, and an additional one in the 14th district. Altogether, the Republicans could have won at most 7 districts out of the total 18 in the past. 7 out of 18 is not 41%, but it's pretty darn close. It's 39% across the state. In this brand new map, despite the margins relatively unchanged between Democrats and Republicans over the past 3 elections in the state of Illinois, you see here now that the Republicans would have 3 out of 17 districts. That would give them 17.6% in terms of total representation, completely undermining the point of a fair process. But at the end of the day, when both parties are fighting fire with fire, you're always going to end up with just a complete insane map. And that's exactly what we're seeing in the state of Illinois. And the Republicans are by no means any better when it comes down to this in Ohio. That's why I'm using this as another extreme. It's another polar opposite of what we've seen in the state of Illinois. There are other states that I could have used, but I think this is the most recent one, and it certainly shows the most insane gerrymander I have even seen for the 2022 redistricting process. And I used to say that about the state of Illinois. And now these new maps are only getting worse and worse. At least in the past, when Republicans had full control, they gave the Democratic Party about 25% in terms of total representation. What this new map does is absolutely egregious. It's just completely wrong to see it from a moral standpoint. But looking at the state of Ohio, Donald Trump received 53% of the vote in the 2020 election, 53.3%. Joe Biden received 45.2%. That is a margin of 8.1%. For any Republican or any Democrat or any independent, anyone who is in politics, to tell you that this state should have this amount of Republican representation is absolutely wrong. This is a complete power grab by the Ohio Republican Party, and I'm calling it how it is. Because take a look at this map. In the old map, the Democratic Party had 4 Democratic representatives. They had 3 safe districts, with Shontel Brown in Ohio's 11th, with Marcy Kaptur in Ohio's 9th, and then in the inner city with Columbus, with Joyce Beatty with Ohio's 3rd congressional district. Tim Ryan, someone who ran for president, was a pretty notable name, has been able to win in his 13th district, even though it has a partisan lean of even. So it tilts actually a little bit to the right when it comes down to disregarding the national average, but based off of our national environment, it has a partisan lean of even. Now, in this brand new map, yes, Ohio is losing a district, so of course the Republican Party says we're cutting out a Democratic district. It's not enough for them that they have 12 out of 16 districts. Now they want to have more than that. In this new map, including the partisan leans where Republicans have the advantage. Again, this means that if the national environment was any less than 4.5% in favor of the Democrats, Republicans would be in the advantage. In fact, they are in the advantage even relative to the rest of the nation. But overall, what this does is takes Marcy Kaptur and puts her in what was a safe district into a Republican +8 district. Her district went from being Democrat +16 to Republican +8. You are talking about an enormous swing to the right wing. Intentional at that. So in this new map, what happens? Well, the Republican Party takes a total lead, including the partisan advantages and all of that included, to a lead of 13 out of 15 seats. Despite the Republican Party in Ohio winning just 53.3% of the vote, this gives the GOP 87% of representation in the state of Ohio. Think about that for a moment. How unfair is this map? Looking at the Democrats, if you want to take a look from their end, they get 13%. In terms of total representation. At least the Republicans in Illinois got 18%, and even that is an extreme gerrymander for the Democratic Party. But for the Republican Party in Ohio, it's even worse, not only because it's less representation for the Democratic Party, but also because they won more of the vote in Ohio than Republicans did in Illinois. And Ohio has actually gone to the Democratic Party in the 21st century. In fact, it went 2 times, in 2008 and 2012. And even as recently as 2018, Democrats won the popular vote in the state of Ohio. In addition to that, they also won a Senate election across the state. So the state of Ohio does have some type of Democratic tendencies at times, and to give them only 13% of representation is absolutely ludicrous. So what happens from here? We know these are extreme gerrymanders. Is there a possibility that they are forcibly redrawn into a fairer, better map for the constituents in these states? And the answer is yes for Ohio, but it's a bit iffy for the state of Illinois. We'll talk about Illinois briefly, just because it is going to be the one that we don't need to mention too much. But we know now that the redistricting maps for the legislative districts, these are not the congressional districts, were actually thrown out by a court, saying that these were unconstitutional. Now, I think partially that this was a big misstep by the Democratic Party in Illinois, because this was actually before the census numbers were available. They passed a new map without being able to accurately change up their districts based off of population shifts. So ultimately, the federal court said no, this is unconstitutional. But they did not say there now needs to be a nonpartisan redistricting commission. So Democrats will have free reign. As long as they follow the Constitution, they can find a way to draw their maps in their favor. And that's what we're going to see in December when it comes down to the legislative districts. Now, when you're looking at the decisions here, when it comes down to the congressional maps, I haven't seen much about whether or not this would actually go to the court system. Some states have different ways of going about whether or not things can be deemed constitutional or not when it comes down to redistricting alone. You might have an independent commission, you might have oversight, you might have just the state legislature choose to approve it or not. Typically speaking, though, it can go to the state Supreme Court and then they can ultimately make a decision. Sometimes there are states where it makes the courts draw a new map if they determine the maps to be unconstitutional. So all around, I think that Illinois has a possibility, I think, of being changed when it comes down to our new maps, but it probably won't, given Illinois' heavy Democratic history. But in the state of Ohio, it's a bit of a different story. Looking at the state of Ohio, there was actually a very aggressive gerrymander back from 2008 to 2012. The 2010 census, looking at the difference here, yes, the Republican Party had 13 districts, the Democrats had 5. Ohio ended up losing 2 congressional districts as a result of redistricting. They went from 20 electoral votes down to 18 from 2008 to 2012. But you can see that after the new maps were drawn, Democrats were stuck with 4 seats, and they stuck with those 4 seats throughout the entirety of the election cycle. Even in 2018, when Democrats won the national popular vote by a margin of 8 points, Ohio did not budge. Even though on this same ballot, a Democrat won a Senate election and nearly won the governor election against the now incumbent governor, Mike DeWine. So looking at Ohio, there were very clear changes here that completely prevented the Democratic Party at any point throughout the 2010s to win a majority of House seats in Ohio because of redistricting. Even in 2012, when Barack Obama won the state, he still did not carry any Democrats across the finish line, not because he couldn't do it, because there were plenty of examples, especially in the United States Senate, Ohio being a prime example, where Obama was able to benefit them down the ballot and was able to turn out voters in ways that might not have turned out on the midterm election cycle. But in the House, it was a done deal. And back then, the Ohio Supreme Court said that this map is constitutional, making this ruling, saying that it does not need to change. Now, this decision was decided 4-3. At the time, the state Supreme Court was held by Republicans by a margin of 7-2, which meant that Republicans at this point in time had an overwhelming amount of say when it comes down to the future of the courts. That's what decided this margin. Sorry, not 7-2. I think it was 5-2 at that point in time. Democrats really were unable to get that switched over vote. But now in the new Supreme Court, it's not nearly as Republican or more right-wing leaning. In more recent elections, in what was actually a majority for the state Supreme Court, where the Democrats had 2 seats and the Republicans had 5. Actually, I believe that margin in the past might have been somewhere around 6-1 or 5-2. I know it was an insane GOP advantage. Now it's narrowed down to about 1 seat. And that's because Judith French lost her election in the 2020 election. While on the same ballot, it was just very interesting to see how Republicans still ended up winning their race. It seems to be a flip-flop here. But ultimately, someone with a Democratic background, a liberal ideology, ended up now on the Ohio Supreme Court and can rule on this case. So the state Supreme Court is more liberal and has more left-leaning justices than they did in the past, and thus they can make a ruling that is different than the one that was made in the past, dealing with the Ohio redistricting map from 2011. Looking at this map, looking at the call that was made, there was still Republicans moving over to the quote-unquote Democratic side to shoot down these maps. More so people that had this idea that constitutionality was directly correlated with fairly representing, or directly connected with fairly representing the constituents of Ohio. Now, the majority of the justices did not believe this, but the Chief Justice actually was on the opposing side. Now the Chief Justice is still there, and there's an additional Democrat on that side. So if it goes to the Supreme Court, which I have no doubt in my mind that people will 100% try, and I'm telling you right now, people are already trying to get it there, the Supreme Court will likely rule in the favor of the Democrats and say that this map is unconstitutional. But as it stands now, and it doesn't even matter if they rule it or not, at the end of the day, the Republican Party passed this map primarily to benefit themselves, the same way the Democrats did in Illinois. Both sides are wrong in this case, but it's not necessarily for no reason. They are trying to fight fire with fire because neither side is letting up when it comes down to the redistricting cycle. I think there may have been some points where Democrats are disappointed in some of the maps that they're seeing. For instance, in the state of Maryland, where we actually see one of these new maps here, it looks like the Democratic Party might actually be following through with this map that would give Andy Harris, an incumbent, a part of the Freedom Caucus, someone who does not represent Maryland as a state, but definitely represents that first district in terms of ideology, take out a piece of Annapolis, draw it in a way to make it a more competitive seat, but still a Republican-leaning one, instead of making it an 8-0 map that could totally be drawn, given Maryland's demographics and given Maryland's areas with a lot of support for the Democratic Party. One thing that also is changing, too, in this district that just particularly applies to me, I believe I am now being drawn out of the 5th Congressional District, unfortunately. I'm not entirely sure. I need to go ahead and take a look. I should be somewhere around this area, so I'm either with Anthony Brown or Steny Hoyer. I would prefer to be under Steny Hoyer simply because he's been my representative for the past since I was born. But again, I don't make that call. The Maryland Democrats do. But looking around this new type of era, not even new, gerrymandering has been around for a long time, but this continued era of polarizing politics and gerrymandering that has ravaged across the nation. Both sides are going to full-on political extremes to benefit themselves. And while unfortunate to see, I cannot say that I am surprised in the least bit. We knew this was happening years in advance. We knew this was happening on both sides. But to see a map where Republicans get 17% in terms of representation instead of 41%, and Democrats get 13% instead of 45%, it's absolutely upsetting. And I do think that we need to correct this as a nation at some point in time. But I'm telling you right now, 2020, or 2021 rather, is not going to be the year for that. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my redistricting cycle election analysis. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.